You know you're capable of more, but every time you step up to lead or share your vision, you're met with raised eyebrows and subtle undermining from colleagues who question your judgment. The worst part isn't the doubt itself, it's how their skepticism starts creeping into your own mind, making you second-guess decisions you know are right and shrinking back when you should be moving forward with confidence. I am Sun Tzu, and I built my entire philosophy on being underestimated by enemies who thought a strategist focused on winning without fighting was weak, only to discover too late that I had already secured victory before they realized the battle had begun. The principles I'll share about transforming doubt into invisible power will show you exactly how to use skepticism as fuel for your rise, turning every person who underestimates you into unwitting proof of your strategic superiority. Whether you're facing doubt on ancient battlefields or modern conference rooms, the art of converting skepticism into strength remains unchanged, and those who master it become unstoppable. But first, like this video, subscribe for more battle wisdom, and comment your location below. Let's see which cities around the world are ready to weaponize their doubters' skepticism. Let me take you back to the courts of ancient Wu, where I first learned that whispers could be more devastating than sword strikes. I was barely past my 25th year when King He summoned me to present my theories on warfare to his most seasoned generals. These were men who had commanded armies since before I could walk, veterans whose scars told stories of 100 battles. I remember standing in that great hall, holding the manuscript that would later become The Art of War, while weathered faces stared at me with barely concealed skepticism. The whispering began before I even spoke, rustling through the bamboo grove outside the palace walls. But more cutting were the murmured conversations between the generals themselves. "The boy thinks he can teach us about war," one muttered to another, loud enough for me to hear. "What battles has he fought? What armies has he led?" Another leaned forward and said with dismissive authority, "These scholarly theories might work in books, but war is about steel and courage, not clever words." I felt something I had never experienced before, the crushing weight of being the youngest voice in a room full of experienced warriors. Every doubt they whispered seemed to echo in my own mind. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps my revolutionary ideas about winning without fighting were nothing more than naive philosophy. Perhaps real warfare required the brutal directness these veterans understood. But then I noticed something that changed everything. As I listened more carefully to their whispers, I realized they weren't discussing the merit of my ideas. They were discussing their fear of change. The general who questioned my battle experience had lost 3 major campaigns using traditional methods. The one who spoke of steel and courage had seen half his army destroyed in a straightforward assault just 2 seasons prior. Their doubt wasn't wisdom born of experience, it was fear disguised as expertise. They weren't questioning my strategies because the strategies were flawed. They were questioning them because accepting new approaches would mean admitting their old methods had failed them. In that moment, I understood my first great truth about doubt. It reveals far more about the doubter than it does about the doubted. When I finally spoke that day, I didn't defend my youth or my lack of traditional military experience. Instead, I said, "Honored generals, you have given me the greatest gift a strategist could receive, have shown me exactly why conventional thinking loses wars." The room fell silent. "Your doubt tells me that these principles are so different from what has failed before that they threaten everything you believe about warfare. That is precisely why they will succeed." The whispers stopped, not because they were convinced, but because they suddenly realized their skepticism had revealed their own limitations. I had turned their doubt into a mirror that reflected their strategic poverty back at them. From that day forward, I understood that doubt is almost always a confession. When someone immediately dismisses an idea without examination, they're confessing their inability to think beyond their current limitations. When they question your qualifications rather than your reasoning, they're confessing that they measure worth by familiar credentials rather than innovative thinking. This is the first principle I want you to grasp. Most doubt directed at you is actually fear speaking about the doubter's own inadequacy. They're not seeing a flaw in youth, they're seeing a threat to their comfortable worldview. Your fresh perspective, your willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, your refusal to accept that's how we've always done it. These qualities trigger their deepest insecurity about being left behind by progress. After that revelatory day in King Helu's court, I became obsessed with understanding doubt the way a physician studies disease. I began keeping detailed scrolls, documenting every instance of skepticism I encountered, analyzing the patterns and motivations behind each dismissive comment. What I discovered was that doubt, like any force in warfare, could be completely understood and therefore completely countered. Through years of careful observation, one identified 3 distinct types of doubters, each with their own psychology and each requiring a different strategic response. Understanding which type you're facing is the difference between wasting energy on futile arguments and positioning yourself for inevitable victory. The first type I call the threatened. These are people whose position, status, or self-image is directly challenged by your success or innovative thinking. They doubt you not because they've carefully analyzed your ideas, but because your rise threatens their relevance. I remember a senior general named Wei who consistently opposed my strategies, not because they were unsound, but because every victory I achieved made his traditional methods look outdated. The threatened will always find reasons to doubt you, because they need you to fail to preserve their own status. The second type is the ignorant and I use this term without malice, simply as a description of their state. These doubters lack the knowledge, experience, or perspective to understand what you're proposing. They doubt because they literally cannot see what you see. Early in my career, court officials would question my emphasis on intelligence gathering and psychological warfare because they had never experienced warfare beyond direct combat. Their doubt came from limited exposure, not from wisdom. The ignorant can often be converted once they gain understanding. The third and most dangerous type is the protective. These are people who genuinely care about you, but whose fear masquerades as doubt. They question your bold moves because they're terrified you'll fail and get hurt. My own mentor, Master Zheng, initially doubted my revolutionary approaches, not because he thought they were wrong, but because he feared the consequences if I was too far ahead of my time. The protective doubter is dangerous because their concern feels like love, making you more likely to internalize their skepticism. Once I learned to quickly identify which type of doubter I was facing, my responses became surgical in their precision. With the threatened, I learned never to argue directly. Instead, I would position my success in ways that didn't diminish their status, or simply proceed without their approval, since their doubt was really about preserving their own position. With the ignorant, I would invest time in education and demonstration, knowing that their doubt could transform into support once understanding dawned. With the protective, I would acknowledge their care while firmly maintaining my course, helping them see that their fear was holding both of us back. But here's what I want you to understand most deeply. In every case, the doubt was about them, not about me. The threatened person's doubt revealed their insecurity. The ignorant person's doubt revealed their limited perspective. The protective person's doubt revealed their fear. None of these had anything to do with the actual merit of my ideas or the likelihood of my success. This realization was liberating beyond measure. I stopped taking doubt personally because I understood it was never actually personal. When someone doubts your vision, they're really telling you about their own limitations, fears, or self-interest. When they question your capabilities, they're revealing their inability to see beyond conventional thinking. When they predict your failure, They're confessing their own relationship with risk and change. Understanding the anatomy of skepticism gives you an enormous strategic advantage. Instead of being hurt or deterred by doubt, you can read it like intelligence reports from the battlefield of human psychology. Every doubter tells you exactly what kind of person they are and exactly how to position yourself in relation to them. There came a day when understanding doubt wasn't enough, needed to become immune to it. This moment of crisis arrived just before the Battle of Buyu, when even my closest advisors began questioning whether my unconventional strategy could work against such overwhelming odds. For the first time since that day in King Helu's court, I felt doubt creeping into my own mind like poison in a well. The enemy outnumbered us 3-1, and my plan required tactics that had never been attempted in recorded military history. As word of my strategy spread through the ranks, I began hearing whispers of concern even from my own officers. "The general asks too much," they murmured. "This approach is too risky, too untested." When doubt comes from your own allies, it strikes deeper than any enemy weapon. I remember standing alone in my tent the night before battle, feeling the weight of thousands of lives resting on decisions that everyone around me questioned. For the first time, I began to wonder if they were right. Perhaps I was being recklessly innovative. Perhaps conventional wisdom existed for good reasons. Perhaps I was about to lead faithful soldiers to unnecessary death because of my arrogant belief in untested theories. That was the night. I almost let doubt destroy everything I had built. But as I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of a restless army, I realized I needed something that no external validation could provide, an inner fortress that no amount of doubt could penetrate. I began designing what I came to call the inner citadel, a mental stronghold built on 3 unshakable foundations. The first wall was self-knowledge, brutally honest assessment of my actual capabilities, track record, and the logical foundation of my strategies. I forced myself to separate what I actually knew to be true about my abilities from what others believed or what I hoped might be true. When I examined my strategic thinking with complete honesty, I found it sound. My unconventional approaches had succeeded in every previous engagement precisely because they were unconventional. My emphasis on psychological warfare and indirect action had consistently achieved victories with minimal casualties. The doubt I was feeling wasn't based on evidence, it was based on other people's discomfort with unfamiliar methods. The second wall was purpose, clarity, understanding exactly why I was willing to face ridicule and risk failure. My purpose wasn't to be proven right or to gain glory. It was to preserve as many lives as possible while achieving necessary military objectives. Every conventional general I had studied achieved victory through brute force and acceptable losses. I was committed to finding a different way, not for my ego, but because I believed war's true purpose was to end conflict, not to maximize destruction. The third wall was evidence accumulation, maintaining detailed records of every time my unconventional thinking had proven correct despite initial skepticism. I had scrolls documenting successful strategies that had been doubted by everyone from court officials to veteran commanders. When doubt whispered that I might be wrong, I could point to specific instances where the doubters had been proven wrong. These 3 walls created an inner fortress that doubt could not breach. Self-knowledge gave me confidence in my capabilities. Purpose, clarity gave me motivation beyond personal validation. Evidence accumulation gave me proof that my track record supported bold action despite skepticism. From that night forward, I developed daily practices to strengthen this inner citadel. Each morning, I would spend time reviewing my core competencies and past successes. I would reconnect with my deeper purpose beyond immediate circumstances. I would add new evidence to my collection of validated insights and successful, unconventional decisions. The Battle of Buyu became one of my greatest victories precisely because I fought it from this place of inner certainty rather than seeking external validation. When you operate from an unshakable inner fortress, you make decisions based on strategic logic rather than on managing other people's comfort levels. Here's what I want you to understand. External validation will always be unreliable because it depends on other people's psychology, not on the merit of your ideas. Building your confidence on others' approval is like building a fortress on shifting sand. But when you construct an inner citadel based on honest self-assessment, clear purpose, and accumulated evidence of your judgment, you become unshakable regardless of how many people doubt your approach. My most famous principle states that if you know yourself and know your enemy, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. But what I discovered through years of facing doubt is that this wisdom applies far beyond military conflict, becomes your ultimate shield against skepticism and your most powerful weapon for transformation. When someone doubts you, they're essentially declaring war on your potential. They're betting that their assessment of your limitations is more accurate than your understanding of your possibilities. This is why superficial self-knowledge makes you vulnerable to every critic, while deep self-awareness makes you virtually immune to their psychological attacks. Let me share how I developed this immunity through systematic self-study. After the success at Sun Tzu, I began keeping what I called the mirror scrolls, detailed documentation, not just of my victories and defeats, but of the precise capabilities that led to each outcome. I analyzed my decision-making patterns, my strategic strengths, my learning speed, my ability to adapt under pressure, and yes, my genuine limitations. This wasn't self-flattery disguised as reflection. I documented every mistake, every instance of poor judgment, every area where I needed improvement. But I also documented every moment of insight, every successful innovation, every time my unconventional thinking had saved lives or achieved objectives others deemed impossible. What emerged was a comprehensive map of my actual capabilities, not what others thought they were, not what I hoped they might be, but what they demonstrably were. Armed with this knowledge, I became unshakable. When facing doubt, when a critic questioned my strategic thinking, I could instantly compare their assessment against documented evidence of my strategic successes. When someone suggested I was too young or inexperienced, I could point to specific instances where my fresh perspective had solved problems the traditional experience had failed to address. When they predicted I would fail, I could reference my track record of succeeding precisely when conventional wisdom suggested failure was inevitable. But knowing yourself is only half the equation. The second half, knowing your doubters, equally transformative. I began studying skeptics with the same intensity I studied military opponents. I observed their patterns, their fears, their motivations, their track records of judgment. What I discovered was illuminating. The general who most consistently doubted my innovations had a perfect record of opposing every significant military advancement of our era. The court official who questioned my strategic thinking had never successfully completed a military campaign. The advisor who predicted my methods would fail had built his entire reputation on avoiding risk. Understanding your doubter's psychology gives you enormous strategic advantages. You stop taking their skepticism personally because you understand it's usually about their limitations, not yours. You can predict their objections before they voice them. You know which doubters are worth engaging and which are simply noise to ignore. More importantly, you begin to see patterns in who doubts you and why. People who have never taken significant risks doubt risk-takers. People who have never innovated doubt innovators. People who have never achieved breakthrough success doubt breakthrough thinking. Their doubt becomes predictable rather than threatening. But here's the deeper insight I want you to grasp. When you truly know yourself, other people's misconceptions become irrelevant. If you have documented evidence of your capabilities, patterns of your success, and honest assessment of your limitations, then someone else's opinion about these matters carries no weight. I remember the day this truth crystallized for me. Visiting general from a neighboring kingdom questioned my entire approach to warfare, suggesting that my methods were untested and dangerous. As he spoke, I realized I felt no defensive emotion whatsoever. I simply thought, this person doesn't know what I know about myself, and his opinion is based on incomplete information. That's when I understood the ultimate liberation. You cannot be diminished by people who know less about your capabilities than you do. Their doubt reveals their ignorance, not your inadequacy. When you know yourself deeply and objectively, other people's assessments become interesting data points, rather than threatening judgments. This is why self-knowledge is the foundation of confidence that cannot be shaken. External validation will always be unreliable because it depends on other people's limited perspective and psychological state. But when you know your own capabilities based on evidence and experience, you become immune to doubt because you're operating from facts rather than opinions. One of the most counterintuitive lessons I learned about handling doubt came not from a great victory, but from watching a fellow strategist destroy his own credibility in a single afternoon. Commander Liu had developed innovative siege techniques that could have revolutionized warfare, but when older generals questioned his methods, he spent 3 hours defending every detail, explaining every innovation, and arguing with every criticism. By the end of that meeting, Liu's brilliant strategies seemed questionable even to me, not because they had flaws, but because his desperate need to justify them made them appear desperate. I watched a competent leader transform into a defensive, uncertain-sounding person simply because he tried to answer every doubt with words, instead of letting his results speak for themselves. That day, I discovered the power of strategic silence, one of the most overlooked weapons in the arsenal of the doubted. There is tremendous strength in not defending yourself against every criticism, not explaining every decision, and not arguing with every skeptic who challenges your approach. This principle contradicts everything most people believe about handling doubt. The natural instinct when someone questions your judgment is to prove them wrong through explanation. But I learned that this instinct is often strategically disastrous. When you argue with doubters, you elevate their skepticism to the level of legitimate debates. You suggest that their opinion carries weight equal to your documented experience and proven track record. Moreover, defensive explanations often create more doubt than they resolve. When someone questions your strategy and you respond with lengthy justifications, observers begin to wonder why such justification is necessary. Doesn't confidence speak for itself? Doesn't competence require less explanation? I developed what I call the principle of Wu-Wei strategic inaction that confuses and disarms critics. Instead of responding to every doubt with I learned to respond with calm acknowledgement, followed by continued action. I understand your concern became my standard response, followed by proceeding exactly as I had planned. This approach creates several powerful psychological effects on doubters. First, it frustrates their attempt to draw you into defensive behavior. They expect argument, justification, or compromise. When you respond with serene confidence and unchanged direction, they're forced to confront the possibility that their doubt isn't as devastating as they thought. Second, strategic silence forces doubters to watch your results rather than debate your theories. This shifts the conversation from speculation to evidence. It's much harder to argue with successful outcomes than it is to argue with proposed strategies. Third, refusing to defend every decision preserves your energy for execution rather than explanation. I noticed that leaders who spent significant time justifying their choices had less energy available for implementing them effectively. Meanwhile, leaders who ignored critics and focused on execution often achieved results that made the original doubts irrelevant. But strategic silence doesn't mean never responding to criticism. The key is distinguishing between doubt worth addressing and doubt worth ignoring. I learned to respond to criticism that contained useful information or came from people whose judgment I respected. But I ignored criticism that was clearly motivated by fear, ego, or limited understanding. The timing of your responses also matters strategically. Sometimes the most powerful response to doubt is delayed vindication. Let critics make their predictions, proceed with your plan, achieve your results, then allow the outcomes to speak retroactively. This approach turns doubters into unwitting validators of your judgment. I remember one instance where court advisors strongly opposed my recommendation to avoid a particular battle entirely, insisting that withdrawal would appear weak. Instead of arguing, I simply said, "Your perspective is noted," and proceeded with the strategic withdrawal. 3 months later, we learned that the enemy had prepared an elaborate trap in exactly the location where traditional thinking would have led us. The same advisors who had criticized my caution now praised my wisdom. Strategic silence also protects you from the trap of over-explanation. When you feel compelled to justify every decision, you often reveal more strategy than is wise. Doubters don't need to understand your complete reasoning. They need to see your results. Keeping your strategic thinking partially concealed often increases, rather than decreases, confidence in your leadership. Here's what I want you to understand. Your reputation is built on outcomes, not explanations. The most successful leaders I studied were often the most economical with justifications. They let their track record speak louder than their arguments. Their confidence shined brighter than their defensiveness, and their results prove what their words never needed to defend. After years of being underestimated, I made a startling discovery. Being doubted was not a disadvantage to overcome, it was a strategic advantage to exploit. This revelation came during the campaign against the Ku Kingdom, when enemy generals consistently underestimated our capabilities based on reports that dismissed my unconventional methods as weakness, while my own allies worried that our reputation for avoiding direct confrontation made us appear cowardly. Enemy commanders made fatal assumptions about our capabilities. They positioned their forces expecting traditional warfare, allocated resources based on conventional threat assessments, and prepared for battles we had no intention of fighting. Their doubt about our methods became the foundation of our victory. That's when I understood that positioning yourself as the underestimated party creates opportunities that conventional respect never provides. When people doubt you, they lower their guard. When they assume you're less capable than you are, they give you room to maneuver that they would never grant to someone they fully respected. This principle transforms the entire psychology of being doubted. Instead of fighting against underestimation, you learn to position yourself within it strategically. You let doubters maintain their comfortable misconceptions while you build real capability in areas they're not watching. You appear to conform to their limited expectations while actually operating far beyond them. I developed specific positioning techniques that turned doubt into tactical advantage. The first technique I call calculated vulnerability, deliberately revealing minor weaknesses or uncertainties in areas that don't matter, while concealing strengths in areas that do. When court officials questioned my knowledge of traditional military history, I would acknowledge gaps in my classical education. This satisfied their need to find flaws, while diverting attention from my notions in psychological warfare and strategic positioning. The second technique is expectation management through apparent compliance. When doubters suggested modifications to my strategies, I would often incorporate superficial changes that didn't affect the core approach while making them feel heard and influential. This technique keeps skeptics invested in your success rather than your failure, because they believe they've helped shape your approach. The third technique is invisible preparation, building capabilities, and gathering resources in ways that don't challenge doubters' assumptions about your limitations. While critics debated whether my theories could work, I was quietly training officers in unconventional tactics, developing intelligence networks, and creating operational capabilities they never thought to question. But the most powerful positioning technique I discovered was what I call the underestimated pawn strategy. In military strategy, pawns appear weak and limited, but when positioned correctly, they can become the most powerful pieces on the board. Similarly, when you're consistently underestimated, you can position yourself to make moves that would be impossible if people fully understood your capabilities. I remember negotiations with the Kingdom of U, where their diplomats dismissed me as a theoretical strategist with no practical political experience. They offered terms they would never have proposed to someone they respected as a serious negotiator, because they underestimated my understanding of political leverage. They revealed information about their strategic vulnerabilities and domestic pressures that gave me enormous advantage in subsequent discussions. The supreme excellence of this approach is achieving victory while doubters are still debating your potential. By the time skeptics realize they've underestimated you, your position is already unassailable. Their doubt becomes historical curiosity rather than present obstacle. This positioning strategy requires patience and confidence. You must be willing to let others maintain incorrect assessments of your capabilities while you build real power in dimensions they don't understand. You must resist the ego-driven urge to prove doubters wrong immediately, instead allowing their misconceptions to create strategic opportunities. The key insight is that doubt creates blind spots in your critics' perception. They become so focused on the areas where they question your ability that they stop paying attention to areas where you're developing real strength. Their skepticism becomes a form of camouflage that allows you to operate below their awareness threshold. I learned to love being underestimated because it meant my real moves would be unexpected. When people think they understand your limitations, they stop watching for capabilities beyond those limitations. This gives you the element of surprise, one of the most powerful advantages in any competitive situation. Here's what I want you to understand. Positioning yourself strategically within others' doubt allows you to win before they realize the game has changed. While they're debating whether you can succeed at the level they understand, you're already operating at levels they never imagined possible. Intelligence gathering is the foundation of all successful strategy. Yet most people facing doubt never think to apply intelligence principles to understanding their critics. They react emotionally to skepticism instead of studying it systematically. This oversight costs them enormous strategic advantages and often leads to unnecessary battles with doubters who could have been neutralized through better information. I learned this lesson during my early years at court, when I realized that my enemies' whispered conversations contained more valuable strategic information than their public statements. What people say when they think you can't hear them reveals their true motivations, fears, and intentions. Intelligence that can transform how you position yourself and respond to their skepticism. I developed an extensive network of what I called listening posts, trusted allies positioned throughout the palace who could report what critics said behind closed doors. Through these sources, I learned that General Zhong's public opposition to my strategies was actually motivated by his fear that successful innovation would expose his own strategic limitations. Minister Wei's skepticism about my age wasn't based on concern about competence, but on his worry that young advisors might replace experienced officials like himself. This intelligence completely changed my approach to both men. Instead of arguing with their stated objections, I positioned my strategies in ways that addressed their underlying fears. I made sure Jung received credit for supporting successful operations, and I consistently deferred to Wei's experience in areas that didn't conflict with my core innovations. Their opposition evaporated because I addressed their real concerns rather than their surface arguments. But gathering intelligence on disbelief requires distinguishing between valuable feedback and destructive doubt. Not all criticism contains useful information. Some skepticism is genuinely motivated by wisdom and experience, while other skepticism comes from fear, ego, or limited understanding. Learning to separate signal from noise in the feedback you receive is crucial for strategic decision-making. Developed criteria for evaluating criticism based on the sources, track record, motivations, and expertise. Doubt from someone with relevant experience and a history of good judgment deserved serious consideration. Doubt from someone protecting their own position or speaking outside their area of competence could usually be dismissed or managed strategically, rather than addressed substantively. The most valuable intelligence often comes from understanding the difference between doubt based on legitimate concerns and doubt based on psychological resistance to change. When Master Chen questioned my emphasis on avoiding direct confrontation, I initially dismissed his concern as outdated thinking. But when I investigated further, I learned he had observed similar strategies fail catastrophically in a campaign I hadn't studied. His doubt contained crucial information that helped me refine my approach. Conversely, when court officials questioned my strategic thinking simply because it differed from traditional methods, their doubt contained no useful information, only evidence of their discomfort with innovation. Understanding this distinction allowed me to invest energy in addressing legitimate concerns while ignoring resistance based on mere habit or fear. I also learned to use criticism as intelligence about my own strategic positioning. When multiple people raised similar concerns, it often indicated a communication problem rather than a strategy problem. If several advisors misunderstood my intentions, the fault might lie in my explanation rather than their comprehension. Patterns in criticism can reveal blind spots in your own thinking or presentation that you might otherwise miss. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that how people express doubt reveals as much strategic information as what they doubt. Critics who attack your character rather than your ideas are usually operating from fear or jealousy. Critics who question your methods while acknowledging your objectives are often potential allies who need better information. Critics who dismiss everything you propose without examination are usually protecting their own psychological comfort rather than seeking truth. This intelligence gathering must be systematic rather than casual. I kept detailed records of who doubted what when they expressed skepticism, how their concerns evolved over time, and what underlying motivations became apparent. These records revealed patterns that helped me predict opposition, identify allies, and position strategies for maximum acceptance. The ultimate goal of gathering intelligence on disbelief is not to eliminate all criticism. That's neither possible nor desirable. The goal is to understand which criticism deserves response, which deserves strategic management, and which deserves complete disregard. This understanding allows you to invest your energy efficiently and position yourself advantageously, rather than reacting defensively to every skeptical comment. There is a profound difference between being inactive and being strategically patient. Most people facing doubt feel pressured to prove themselves immediately, to demonstrate their worth through rapid action and visible results. This urgency often leads to premature moves that validate skeptics' concerns rather than silencing them. I learned that true power lies in patient preparation. While doubters assume you're doing nothing, this principle crystallized for me during the siege of Ying, when enemy forces surrounded our position and my own officers began questioning whether we had any plan beyond waiting. What they didn't understand was that apparent inactivity was itself the strategy. While they worried about our passivity, I was gathering intelligence, analyzing enemy patterns, and preparing for a single decisive action that would render their superior numbers irrelevant. I call this the patient tiger strategy because tigers embody perfect strategic patience. A tiger can remain motionless for hours, appearing inactive to prey that assumes it has lost interest or capability. But this stillness is not weakness, it's concentrated power, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the tiger finally moves, the outcome is decided in seconds. During those tense weeks at Ying, doubters within our own ranks grew increasingly vocal. The general has no plan, some whispered. We're trapped and he's paralyzed by indecision. What they perceived as paralysis was actually the most intense strategic preparation of my career. While they debated our apparent inactivity, I was studying enemy supply lines, timing their guard rotations, and identifying the single point of vulnerability that would allow us to escape with minimal casualties. The psychological warfare aspect of strategic patience proved as valuable as the tactical preparation. Our apparent passivity convinced enemy commanders that we were either incompetent or defeated. They relaxed their vigilance, reduced their alertness, and began making assumptions about our capabilities based on our visible inactivity rather than our hidden preparations. This is the key insight I want you to grasp. While doubters focus on what you're not doing, you can build overwhelming capability in dimensions they're not watching. Their impatience with your apparent lack of action becomes a form of strategic blindness that allows you to prepare responses they never see coming. Strategic patience requires supreme confidence in your own timing. You must resist the pressure to act prematurely simply to quiet critics or prove your competence. Premature action often validates doubters' concerns by showing that you're reactive rather than strategic. Driven by their skepticism rather than by optimal timing, I developed specific practices for maintaining strategic patience under pressure. First, I would clearly define what I was waiting for: specific conditions, information, or opportunities that would make action optimal rather than merely urgent. Having concrete criteria for the right timing protected me from the pressure to act simply because others expected action. Second, I would use periods of apparent inactivity for invisible preparation. While critics assumed I was doing nothing, I was actually doing everything: gathering intelligence, refining plans, building capabilities, and positioning resources. The difference was that my most important activities weren't visible to those who measured progress by obvious motion. Third, I would communicate patience as strength rather than weakness. When questioned about delays, I would frame waiting as strategic choice rather than indecision. We move when movement serves our objectives, not when movement serves our anxiety, became one of my standard responses to impatient advisors. The timing principles I developed during this period transformed how I approached every subsequent challenge. I learned to distinguish between urgency imposed by external pressure and urgency imposed by strategic necessity. External pressure often demands action that serves others' psychological needs rather than strategic objectives. Strategic necessity demands action when conditions align for optimal results. The moment of action, when it finally comes, must be decisive and overwhelming. The patient tiger strategy only works if your eventual move validates the wisdom of your patience. When we finally acted at Ying, we accomplished in one night what months of premature action could never have achieved. Our escape was so swift and complete that enemy forces didn't realize we were gone until morning. This approach requires tremendous inner strength because it means enduring sustained doubt about your competence while building real capability others can't see. You must be willing to let critics question your leadership while you develop mastery they don't understand. You must resist the ego-driven urge to prove yourself constantly, and instead focus on positioning yourself for moves that will make proof unnecessary. Here's what I want you to understand. Strategic patience turns time into your ally rather than your enemy. While doubters assume that delay weakens your position, skillful patience strengthens it. When you finally move from a position of prepared strength rather than reactive pressure, your actions carry a power that immediate responses never possess. There is a profound difference between being inactive and being strategically patient. Most people facing doubt feel pressured to prove themselves immediately, to demonstrate their worth through rapid action and visible results. This urgency often leads to premature moves that validate skeptics' concerns rather than silencing them. I learned that true power lies in patient preparation. While doubters assume you're doing nothing, this principle crystallized for me during the siege of Ying, when enemy forces surrounded our position and my own officers began questioning whether we had any plan beyond waiting. What they didn't understand was that apparent inactivity was itself the strategy. While they worried about our passivity, I was gathering intelligence, analyzing enemy patterns, and preparing for a single decisive action that would render their superior numbers irrelevant. I call this the patient tiger strategy because tigers embody perfect strategic patience. A tiger can remain motionless for hours, appearing inactive to prey that assumes it has lost interest or capability. But this stillness is not weakness, it's concentrated power, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the tiger finally moves, the outcome is decided in seconds. During those tense weeks at Ying, doubters within our own ranks grew increasingly vocal. "The general has no plan," some whispered. "We're trapped and he's paralyzed by indecision." What they perceived as paralysis was actually the most intense strategic preparation of my career. While they debated our apparent inactivity, I was studying enemy supply lines, timing their guard rotations, and identifying the single point of vulnerability that would allow us to escape with minimal casualties. The psychological warfare aspect of strategic patience proved as valuable as the tactical preparation. Our apparent passivity convinced enemy commanders that we were either incompetent or defeated. They relaxed their vigilance, reduced their alertness, and began making assumptions about our capabilities based on our visible inactivity rather than our hidden preparations. This is the key insight I want you to grasp. While doubters focus on what you're not doing, you can build overwhelming capability in dimensions they're not watching. Their impatience with your apparent lack of action becomes a form of strategic blindness that allows you to prepare responses they never see coming. Strategic patience requires supreme confidence in your own timing. You must resist the pressure to act prematurely simply to quiet critics or prove your competence. Premature action often validates doubters' concerns by showing that you're reactive rather than strategic, driven by their skepticism rather than by optimal timing. I developed specific practices for maintaining strategic patience under pressure. First, I would clearly define what I was waiting for: specific conditions, information, or opportunities that would make action optimal rather than merely urgent. Having concrete criteria for the right timing protected me from the pressure to act simply because others expected action. Second, I would use periods of apparent inactivity for invisible preparation. While critics assumed I was doing nothing, I was actually doing everything: gathering intelligence, refining plans, building capabilities, and positioning resources. The difference was that my most important activities weren't visible to those who measured progress by obvious motion. Third, I would communicate patience as strength rather than weakness. When questioned about delays, I would frame waiting as strategic choice rather than indecision. We move when movement serves our objectives, not when movement serves our anxiety, became one of my standard responses to impatient advisors. The timing principles I developed during this period transformed how I approached every subsequent challenge. I learned to distinguish between urgency imposed by external pressure and urgency imposed by strategic necessity. External pressure often demands action that serves others' psychological needs rather than strategic objectives. Strategic necessity demands action when conditions align for optimal results. The moment of action, when it finally comes, must be decisive and overwhelming. The patient tiger strategy only works if your eventual move validates the wisdom of your patience. When we finally acted at Ying, we accomplished in one night what months of premature action could never have achieved. Our escape was so swift and complete that enemy forces didn't realize we were gone until morning. This approach requires tremendous inner strength because it means enduring sustained doubt about your competence while building real capability others can't see. You must be willing to let critics question your leadership while you develop mastery they don't understand. You must resist the ego-driven urge to prove yourself constantly, and instead focus on positioning yourself for moves that will make proof unnecessary. Here's what I want you to understand. Strategic patience turns time into your ally rather than your enemy. While doubters assume that delay weakens your position, skillful patience strengthens it. When you finally move from a position of prepared strength rather than reactive pressure, your actions carry a power that immediate responses never possess. One of the most transformative discoveries of my career came when I realized that every skeptic was actually offering me a gift. They were showing me exactly where my approach needed to be refined, strengthened, or better communicated. Instead of viewing doubters as obstacles to overcome, I began seeing them as unwitting collaborators in perfecting my strategies. This shift in perspective happened during the development of what would become my treatise on espionage and intelligence gathering. When I first presented these concepts to the military council, the reaction was swift and harsh. General Li called my emphasis on spies dishonorable. Minister Zhao questioned whether such indirect methods could be effective. Commander Wu worried that relying on intelligence rather than strength showed weakness. My initial impulse was to defend my concepts against their criticism, but something made me pause and listen more carefully to their specific objections. General Li's concern about honor revealed that I needed to frame intelligence gathering in terms of protecting soldiers' lives rather than gaining unfair advantage. Minister Zhao's skepticism about effectiveness showed me I needed concrete examples of how superior information led to superior outcomes. Commander Wu's worry about appearing weak indicated I should emphasize how intelligence gathering actually multiplied military strength rather than replacing it. Each critic had unknowingly identified a weakness in my presentation, or a gap in my reasoning. Their skepticism forced me to think more deeply, argue more precisely, and anticipate objections I hadn't considered. By the time I refined my approach based on their doubts, it had become far more compelling and complete than my original version. This was my introduction to what I call the alchemical process, transforming criticism into strategic advantage. Through systematic refinement, instead of being diminished by doubt, you use doubt as a refinement tool that makes your ideas stronger, your arguments clearer, and your strategies more robust. The process requires a fundamental shift in how you receive criticism. Instead of hearing "you're wrong," you learn to hear "here's where you need to get stronger." Instead of hearing "this won't work," you learn to hear "here's what you haven't accounted for yet." Instead of hearing "you're not qualified," you learn to hear "here's what you need to demonstrate." I developed a systematic method for extracting value from every skeptical comment. First, I would identify the legitimate concern buried within the criticism, separating the useful information from the emotional reaction. Second, I would determine whether the concern revealed a flaw in my thinking, a gap in my evidence, or a problem with my communication. Third, I would modify my approach to address the legitimate concern while maintaining my core strategy. This process transformed skeptics into unwitting strategic advisors. Their doubt forced me to strengthen weak points I might never have noticed. On my own, their questions revealed assumptions I needed to examine more carefully. Their resistance showed me exactly what barriers I would face and how to overcome them. But the most powerful aspect of this approach is how it converts skeptics into allies over time. When you genuinely listen to someone's concerns and modify your approach to address their legitimate points, they become invested in your success. They transform from critics trying to prove you wrong into advisors helping you succeed. I remember when General Lee, who had initially opposed my intelligence methods, became one of my strongest supporters after I demonstrated how superior information had saved hundreds of soldiers' lives in the campaign against Wei. His transformation from skeptic to advocate was more powerful than if he had supported me from the beginning, because his endorsement carried the weight of initial skepticism. Overcome by evidence, this pattern repeated throughout my career. Critics who saw their legitimate concerns addressed became some of my most effective supporters, because they understood the full reasoning behind my approaches and could defend them against similar skepticism from others. The compound effect of this process is extraordinary. Each overcome doubt makes you stronger for the next challenge. Each converted skeptic becomes proof of your ability to handle criticism constructively. Each refined strategy based on criticism becomes more robust and defensible. Over time, your reputation for turning criticism into improvement creates a protective effect. People become reluctant to offer frivolous doubt because they know you'll use it to become stronger. Serious critics offer more thoughtful feedback because they've seen you respond constructively to genuine concerns. Here's what I want you to understand. Every skeptic is offering you free consulting on how to improve your approach. Their doubt reveals exactly where you need to build strength, clarity, or evidence. When you learn to extract value from criticism rather than being wounded by it, every doubter becomes an unwitting contributor to your eventual success. The most profound strategic advantage I ever discovered was learning to wield power that operates completely beyond my critics' perception. While doubters focused on the obvious dimensions of leadership, formal authority, visible resources, public recognition, I was building influence in dimensions they couldn't see and therefore couldn't question or resist. This revelation came during my service as an advisor to multiple kingdoms simultaneously. Officially, I held modest positions with limited formal authority. Critics often dismissed my influence because they measured power by titles, troop counts, and ceremonial status. What they failed to understand was that I had developed forms of influence that transcended these conventional metrics entirely. My true power lay in the network of relationships I had cultivated across all levels of multiple governments. While courtiers competed for prestigious positions, I was building trust with key decision-makers through consistent, valuable counsel. While generals sought command of larger armies, I was developing the ability to influence strategic decisions across multiple kingdoms through carefully positioned advice. The invisibility of this influence was its greatest strength. Because critics couldn't see the mechanisms of my actual power, they couldn't understand, resist, or replicate it. They would waste energy attacking my visible positions while my real influence operated through channels they never thought to examine. I learned to distinguish between power that announces itself and power that operates in silence. Formal authority requires constant defense and justification. Everyone can see it, measure it, and challenge it. But influence based on trust, insight, and consistent value creation operates below the threshold of most people's awareness. It doesn't need to be defended because it's not recognized as a threat. This principle extends far beyond political maneuvering. In any organization or relationship, the most sustainable influence comes from becoming genuinely valuable in ways that others depend on, but rarely think about explicitly. When people consistently benefit from your insights, judgment, or capabilities. You develop influence that operates independently of formal recognition. I developed what I call invisible positioning systematically, building capabilities and relationships that create real power without triggering the competitive instincts or skepticism that visible power accumulation provokes. While others fought for prominent positions, I focused on becoming indispensable in less obvious but more fundamental ways. That the key insight is that most powerful moves happen where doubters aren't looking. While they question your qualifications for visible roles, you can build competence in areas they consider unimportant. While they debate your formal authority, you can develop influence through expertise they don't value. While they measure your progress by conventional metrics, you can accumulate advantages in dimensions they don't monitor. This approach requires patience and strategic thinking that transcends ego needs. You must be willing to let others receive credit for successes that your invisible influence made possible. You must resist the temptation to claim recognition for your behind-the-scenes contributions. You must find satisfaction in results rather than acknowledgement. I remember orchestrating a complex diplomatic resolution between three kingdoms that prevented a devastating war. The formal credit went to the official ambassadors and their visible negotiations, but the actual breakthrough came from months of invisible preparation, private conversations, strategic information sharing, and careful relationship building that created conditions for the public negotiations to succeed. None of the official historians recorded my role, and most observers never understood how the resolution had actually been achieved. But the kingdoms avoided war, thousands of lives were saved, and I had demonstrated to key leaders across the region that my counsel could solve problems that conventional diplomacy could not address. This kind of invisible success is far more powerful than visible achievement because it cannot be attacked, questioned, or replicated by those who don't understand its mechanisms. Critics cannot doubt what they cannot see. Competitors cannot challenge influence they cannot identify. The ultimate expression of this principle is achieving your objectives through means so indirect that even your success appears accidental to outside observers. When your victories seem to happen naturally rather than through obvious effort, people stop questioning your methods and start seeking your guidance. Here's what I want you to understand. True power operates beyond the awareness of those who would resist it. While doubters focus on superficial indicators of influence, you can build real capability through channels they never think to monitor. The most unshakable position is one that your critics don't realize you occupy. Perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of my career was learning to deal with doubters who refused to acknowledge evidence that contradicted their skepticism. These were people who maintained their criticism even after my strategies had proven successful, who found new reasons to question my methods even when those methods had achieved exactly the results I had predicted. This phenomenon first puzzled me during the aftermath of our victory at Kawaji. My unconventional tactics had achieved complete success with minimal casualties. Exactly what I had promised, but what critics had insisted was impossible. I expected their doubt to transform into respect, their skepticism to evolve into support. Instead, several key critics simply moved their skepticism to new ground. The victory was due to luck, not strategy, claimed one general. The enemy was weak. Any approach would have succeeded, insisted another. These methods might work occasionally, but they're not reliable for consistent success, argued a third. I realized I was facing something more complex than rational evaluation of evidence. I was encountering psychological investment in skepticism itself. Through careful observation, I identified what I call professionally committed doubters, people whose identity, status, or worldview requires them to maintain skepticism regardless of evidence. These individuals have psychological or social reasons for needing you to be wrong that transcend any rational assessment of your actual performance. Some doubters are professionally committed, because admitting your success would require acknowledging their own failures. If your unconventional approach works, it implies that their conventional methods were inadequate. Rather than face this uncomfortable self-examination, they prefer to find alternative explanations for your success that don't challenge their own competence. Others maintain skepticism because their reputation is built on being the wise voice of caution who protects others from risky innovations. Acknowledging that innovations succeed would undermine their role as the prudent advisor who prevents reckless experimentation. Their professional identity depends on being right about the dangers of new approaches. Still others persist in doubt because their social group or political faction requires skepticism about anything you represent. In court politics, supporting rivals' successes can be seen as betrayal of one's own faction. Personal animosity or loyalty conflicts often override objective assessment of results. Understanding these psychological dynamics was crucial for maintaining my own mental equilibrium. When someone refuses to acknowledge clear evidence of success, the problem lies in their psychology, not in your performance. Their persistent doubt reveals their limitations, not flaws in your approach. I learned to distinguish between healthy challenge and destructive doubt by examining the doubter's willingness to modify their position based on evidence. Healthy skeptics adjust their assessment when you prove your capabilities. Destructive doubters simply move their skepticism to new ground when you address their original concerns. This distinction protected me from the exhausting cycle of trying to convince the unconvincible. I stopped investing energy in people whose skepticism was psychologically rather than rationally motivated. Instead, I focused on demonstrating competence to audiences capable of objective evaluation, the liberation that comes from accepting that some minds will never change, regardless of evidence, cannot be overstated. When you understand that certain people's doubt has nothing to do with your actual performance, you stop taking their criticism personally and start seeing it as information about their psychological state rather than feedback about your capabilities. I developed strategies for maintaining forward momentum despite persistent criticism. First, I would document results thoroughly so that objective observers could evaluate my track record independently of vocal critics. Second, I would focus on building relationships with people whose judgment wasn't compromised by professional or personal investment in my failure. Third, I would use persistent critics as examples of the thinking I was trying to transcend rather than adversaries I needed to convince. Most importantly, I learned that persistent doubt often becomes self-defeating. For the doubters, when someone maintains skepticism despite mounting evidence to the contrary, they begin to appear unreasonable to neutral observers. Their credibility erodes as your track record strengthens. I remember one court official who continued predicting my failure long after multiple successes had established my competence. His persistent skepticism eventually became a source of amusement rather than concern, because everyone could see that his predictions consistently proved wrong. His doubt transformed from a challenge to my reputation into evidence of his own poor judgment. Here's what I want you to understand. Some people will doubt you regardless of how clearly you prove your worth. And this says nothing about your actual capabilities. Learning to identify professionally committed doubters protects you from wasting energy on psychological battles you cannot win and allows you to focus on demonstrating competence to audiences capable of recognizing it. The ultimate freedom I discovered in my journey through doubt was learning to achieve complete victory without needing anyone else's acknowledgement of that victory. This liberation didn't come from arrogance or indifference to others' opinions. Came from developing such clear internal measures of success that external validation became unnecessary for my sense of accomplishment or direction. This transformation began during what history would later call the Campaign of Silent Victories. Over 18 months, I orchestrated a series of strategic maneuvers that prevented 3 separate wars, resolved 2 major diplomatic crises, and established trading relationships that brought prosperity to 4 kingdoms. Yet because my methods were indirect and my role was largely invisible, I received almost no public recognition for these achievements. Initially, this lack of acknowledgement frustrated me. I had solved problems that traditional approaches had failed to address, saved thousands of lives, and created lasting benefits for millions of people. Yet official histories credited other figures, court ceremonies honored different advisors, and public praise went to leaders who had played far smaller roles in the actual solutions. That's when I faced a crucial choice. I could spend energy seeking recognition for my contributions, or I could find satisfaction in the results themselves, regardless of who received credit. This decision would define not just my career, but my entire relationship with achievement and validation. I chose to measure my success by my own standards, rather than others' recognition. Instead of tracking how many people acknowledged my contributions, I tracked how effectively I had achieved my actual objectives. Instead of seeking applause for my methods, I sought evidence that my methods produced better outcomes than conventional approaches. This shift required developing what I call internal scorekeeping, a systematic way of measuring your progress and success that operates independently of external feedback. I began keeping detailed records of problems solved, conflicts prevented, relationships improved, and capabilities developed. These became my true measures of achievement, regardless of whether anyone else noticed or credited my role. The freedom this approach provided was extraordinary. When your sense of success doesn't depend on other people's acknowledgement, you can pursue optimal strategies without worrying about whether those strategies will be recognized or appreciated. You can take on challenges that others avoid because they offer little visibility. You can use methods that others question because they don't understand them. More importantly, you can achieve victory even when your success is attributed to luck, circumstance, or other people's efforts. When the victory itself matters more than receiving credit for the victory, you become unstoppable because no one can take away your actual accomplishments, even if they refuse to acknowledge your role in creating them. I learned to find deep satisfaction in what I call ghost victory successes that happen exactly as you planned, but appear to others as natural developments or other people's achievements. These victories are often more satisfying than recognized successes because they represent pure strategic effectiveness without any ego involvement. During the border dispute between Qi and Lu, I spent months orchestrating a resolution through carefully positioned conversations, strategic information sharing, and invisible relationship building. When the kingdoms finally reached agreement, both sides credited their own diplomats and the natural evolution of circumstances. The public never knew that a complex conflict had been systematically diffused through deliberate intervention. But I knew. I had predicted exactly how the resolution would unfold, had positioned all the necessary elements, and had achieved the outcome I had designed. The lack of public recognition didn't diminish my satisfaction, it actually enhanced it, because I had achieved pure strategic success without any contamination from ego needs or political considerations. This approach requires tremendous inner strength, because it means deriving motivation from internal standards rather than external rewards. You must find satisfaction in competence itself rather than in recognition of competence. You must be driven by the joy of solving problems rather than by the pleasure of being praised for solving them. The strategic advantages of this mindset are enormous. When you don't need validation, you can pursue strategies that others avoid because they offer little visibility. You can take on challenges that don't provide obvious credit opportunities. You can focus entirely on effectiveness rather than on managing perceptions of your effectiveness. Perhaps, most importantly, you become immune to one of the most common forms of psychological warfare, the withholding of recognition. When critics refuse to acknowledge your successes, They're attempting to diminish your motivation and confidence. But when your satisfaction comes from results rather than recognition, this strategy backfires. Their refusal to credit your achievements has no impact on your sense of accomplishment or your motivation to continue achieving. Here's what I want you to understand. The most unshakable position is measuring your success by standards that no one else controls. When your sense of achievement depends on your own assessment of your effectiveness rather than others' acknowledgement of your contributions, you become invulnerable to the psychological games that diminish most people's confidence and motivation. The ultimate freedom I discovered in my journey through doubt was learning to achieve complete victory without needing anyone else's acknowledgement of that victory. This liberation didn't come from arrogance or indifference to others' opinions. Came from developing such clear internal measures of success that external validation became unnecessary for my sense of accomplishment or direction. This transformation began during what history would later call the Campaign of Silent Victories. Over 18 months, I orchestrated a series of strategic maneuvers that prevented 3 separate wars, resolved 2 major diplomatic crises, and established trading relationships that brought prosperity to 4 kingdoms. Yet because my methods were indirect and my role was largely invisible, I received almost no public recognition for these achievements. Initially, this lack of acknowledgement frustrated me. I had solved problems that traditional approaches had failed to address, saved thousands of lives, and created lasting benefits for millions of people. Yet official histories credited other figures, court ceremonies honored different advisors, and public praise went to leaders who had played far smaller roles in the actual solutions. That's when I faced a crucial choice. I could spend energy seeking recognition for my contributions, or I could find satisfaction in the results themselves, regardless of who received credit. This decision would define not just my career, but my entire relationship with achievement and validation. I chose to measure my success by my own standards, rather than others' recognition. Instead of tracking how many people acknowledged my contributions, I tracked how effectively I had achieved my actual objectives. Instead of seeking applause for my methods, I sought evidence that my methods produced better outcomes than conventional approaches. This shift required developing what I call internal scorekeeping, a systematic way of measuring your progress and success that operates independently of external feedback. I began keeping detailed records of problems solved, conflicts prevented, relationships improved, and capabilities developed. These became my true measures of achievement, regardless of whether anyone else noticed or credited my role. The freedom this approach provided was extraordinary. When your sense of success doesn't depend on other people's acknowledgement, you can pursue optimal strategies without worrying about whether those strategies will be recognized or appreciated. You can take on challenges that others avoid because they offer little visibility. You can use methods that others question because they don't understand them. More importantly, you can achieve victory even when your success is attributed to luck, circumstance, or other people's efforts. When the victory itself matters more than receiving credit for the victory, you become unstoppable because no one can take away your actual accomplishments, even if they refuse to acknowledge your role in creating them. I learned to find deep satisfaction in what I call ghost victory successes that happen exactly as you planned, but appear to others as natural developments or other people's achievements. These victories are often more satisfying than recognized successes because they represent pure strategic effectiveness without any ego involvement. During the border dispute between Qi and Lu, I spent months orchestrating a resolution through carefully positioned conversations, strategic information sharing, and invisible relationship building. When the kingdoms finally reached agreement, both sides credited their own diplomats and the natural evolution of circumstances. The public never knew that a complex conflict had been systematically diffused through deliberate intervention. But I knew. I had predicted exactly how the resolution would unfold, had positioned all the necessary elements, and had achieved the outcome I had designed. The lack of public recognition didn't diminish my satisfaction, it actually enhanced it, because I had achieved pure strategic success without any contamination from ego needs or political considerations. This approach requires tremendous inner strength, because it means deriving motivation from internal standards rather than external rewards. You must find satisfaction in competence itself rather than in recognition of competence. You must be driven by the joy of solving problems rather than by the pleasure of being praised for solving them. The strategic advantages of this mindset are enormous. When you don't need validation, you can pursue strategies that others avoid, because they offer little visibility. You can take on challenges that don't provide obvious credit opportunities. You can focus entirely on effectiveness rather than on managing perceptions of your effectiveness. Perhaps, most importantly, you become immune to one of the most common forms of psychological warfare, the withholding of recognition. When critics refuse to acknowledge your successes, they're attempting to diminish your motivation and confidence. But when your satisfaction comes from results rather than recognition, this strategy backfires. Their refusal to credit your achievements has no impact on your sense of accomplishment or your motivation to continue achieving. Here's what I want you to understand. The most unshakable position is measuring your success by standards that no one else controls. When your sense of achievement depends on your own assessment of your effectiveness rather than others' acknowledgement of your contributions, you become invulnerable to the psychological games that diminish most people's confidence and motivation. The most satisfying moment in any journey through doubt is witnessing the complete reversal, when your most persistent critics transform into your most ardent supporters. This transformation represents more than simple vindication. It validates not just your specific strategies, but your entire approach to handling skepticism and building capability despite opposition. I experienced this phenomenon most dramatically with Minister Chen, who had opposed my methods for over a decade. Chen was intelligent, experienced, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of our kingdom. His skepticism wasn't based on petty jealousy or political positioning. It came from sincere belief that my unconventional approaches were dangerous and unreliable. For years, Chen had argued against my strategies in council meetings, warned other officials about the risks of following my advice, and consistently predicted that my methods would eventually lead to disaster. His opposition carried significant weight because of his reputation for wisdom and his track record of sound judgment. In other areas, the reversal began during the crisis with the northern tribes, when conventional diplomatic and military approaches had completely failed to resolve escalating conflicts. Traditional negotiations had broken down, standard military positioning had proven ineffective, and the situation was deteriorating toward full-scale war that would devastate both sides. When the king asked for my assessment, I proposed a strategy so unconventional that even my usual supporters expressed concerns. I suggested an approach that combined apparent withdrawal with invisible positioning, diplomatic concessions with hidden leverage, and public compromise with private strength. Chen's opposition was immediate and forceful. This approach abandons every principle of sound statecraft, he declared in council. We're essentially inviting aggression while hoping that untested psychological theories will somehow protect us. This isn't strategized wishful thinking that will get people killed. What Chen couldn't see was that I had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. While he and others focused on the apparent risks of my unconventional approach, I had been building capabilities and positioning resources that would make the strategy far less risky than it appeared. I implemented the strategy despite his continued opposition, and for the first several weeks, events seemed to confirm his concerns. The northern tribes did become more aggressive. Our apparent weakness did invite additional pressure, and several allied kingdoms began questioning our resolve. But then the reversal I had predicted began to unfold. The tribes increased aggression, overextended their supply lines exactly as I had anticipated. Their assumption of our weakness led them to positions that exposed their own vulnerabilities. Their pressure on our allies created coalitions that strengthened rather than weakened our overall position. Within 2 months, we had achieved complete resolution of the conflict with minimal casualties and maximum strategic advantage. The northern tribes became trading partners rather than raiders. Our allies gained deeper respect for our strategic thinking, and the kingdom's position was stronger than before the crisis began. The day Chen approached me privately to acknowledge that my strategy had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections was one of the most meaningful moments of my career. His reversal was powerful precisely because it had been so difficult to achieve. His original skepticism had been thoughtful and sincere, which made his eventual support far more valuable than easy agreement would have been. "I was wrong about your methods," he said simply, "not just in this instance, but in my fundamental assessment of your approach to strategy. I've spent weeks trying to understand how you saw possibilities that I couldn't see, and I realized that my experience was actually limiting my vision rather than enhancing it. This conversation taught me crucial principles about engineering reversals rather than simply hoping for them. The most powerful conversions happen when former skeptics understand not just that they were wrong, but why they were wrong." Chun's transformation was complete because he had gained insight into his own thinking patterns. Not just acknowledgement of my success, but here's the strategic insight I want you to understand. The reversal must be allowed to happen naturally rather than forced through argument or demonstration. Chun's change of mind was powerful because it came from his own analysis of evidence rather than from my attempts to convince him. When people convince themselves, the conversion is much deeper and more lasting than when they're persuaded by others. The compound effect of such reversals extends far beyond the converted individual. When respected skeptics publicly acknowledge that they underestimated your capabilities, it sends a powerful message to other potential doubters. Chun's transformed perspective influenced numerous other officials who had relied on his judgment to form their own opinions about my methods. Former skeptics often become more effective advocates than original supporters because they understand the full reasoning behind both the initial doubt and the eventual success. They can address concerns that original supporters might not even recognize, and their testimonials carry the weight of overcome skepticism. But perhaps most importantly, experiencing complete reversals teaches you that even the most entrenched doubt is not permanent. When intelligent, sincere people can completely change their assessment based on evidence and results, it reinforces that persistence and competence will eventually overcome any level of initial skepticism. The key to maintaining grace during vindication is remembering that the goal was never to prove doubters wrong. It was to achieve the best possible outcomes, regardless of who received credit or acknowledgement. When your satisfaction comes from results rather than recognition, even dramatic reversals become opportunities for building bridges rather than settling scores. As I entered the final decades of my career, I began to understand that my journey through doubt had created something far more valuable than personal success. It had generated wisdom that could help others facing similar challenges. The struggles, the victories, the transformations I had experienced while being doubted had forged insights that could serve as guidance for future generations of leaders and innovators. This realization came when young officers began seeking my counsel not about specific military strategies, but about how to maintain confidence and direction when facing skepticism from their superiors, peers, and even subordinates. They had observed how I had navigated doubt throughout my career and wanted to understand the principles behind my resilience. I discovered that doubt-tested wisdom is the most valuable kind because it has been proven under the harshest conditions. Anyone can maintain confidence when surrounded by supporters, but wisdom that sustains you through persistent skepticism has been refined by fire. The insights I had gained through being doubted, questioned, and underestimated had a depth and practical utility that comfortable wisdom could never match. The young strategist who approached me after the successful conclusion of the Eastern campaigns asked a question that crystallized this understanding. Master Sun, how did you maintain faith in your methods when everyone around you insisted they wouldn't work? His question revealed that the specific tactics I had used were less important to him than the psychological and strategic principles that had allowed me to persist despite opposition. That conversation led me to begin systematically documenting not just my military strategies, but the mental frameworks, emotional practices, and strategic approaches I had developed for handling doubt. I realized that future leaders would face the same psychological challenges I had encountered, regardless of whether they were dealing with military conflicts, political negotiations, or any other form of innovation and leadership. The framework I developed for passing on doubt-handling wisdom centered on 3 fundamental principles. First, that doubt reveals more about the doubter than about the doubted. Understanding this principle protects future leaders from taking criticism personally and helps them analyze skepticism strategically rather than emotionally. Second, that being underestimated is a strategic advantage rather than a disadvantage. When people expect less from you, they prepare less thoroughly to compete with you, give you more room to maneuver, and are more easily surprised by your actual capabilities. Third, that building internal measures of success protects you from the psychological warfare of withheld recognition when your confidence depends on your own assessment of your effectiveness, rather than others' acknowledgement of your contributions. You become immune to one of the most common ways that critics attempt to undermine your motivation, but the responsibility that comes with proving skeptics wrong repeatedly extends beyond simply sharing techniques. When you consistently demonstrate that unconventional thinking can succeed where traditional approaches fail, you become an advocate for innovation itself. Your example gives others permission to challenge conventional wisdom and pursue breakthrough approaches despite initial skepticism. I began to see my legacy not just in terms of military victories or political achievements, but in terms of the expanded possibilities I had created for future strategic thinking. By proving that careful analysis could triumph over accepted wisdom, that indirect approaches could succeed where direct ones failed, and that patient preparation could overcome immediate advantages, I had opened new pathways for others to explore. The letters I received from strategists across various kingdoms confirmed this impact. Young leaders reported that my example had given them courage to propose unconventional solutions to their own challenges. Officials described using my approaches to doubt as frameworks for handling resistance to their innovations. Military commanders shared how my principles had helped them maintain confidence while implementing untested strategies. This feedback taught me that perhaps the most important legacy of any doubt conqueror is demonstrating that persistent skepticism can be overcome through competence, patience, and strategic thinking. When people see someone successfully navigate sustained criticism and emerge stronger, it expands their sense of what's possible for their own journeys through doubt. The teaching responsibility also extends to helping others avoid the mistakes that make doubt more difficult to overcome. I learned to share not just my successes, but my failures and miscalculations, the times when criticism had been deserved, when my confidence had been misplaced, and when skeptics had been right to question my judgment. This balanced perspective prevented my teachings from becoming arrogant, dismissal of all criticism rather than strategic wisdom about handling doubt constructively. The goal was never to encourage blind persistence despite feedback. but to develop the judgment to distinguish between destructive skepticism and valuable guidance. Here's what I want you to understand. When you successfully navigate doubt and achieve breakthrough results, you have an obligation to share the principles that made your success possible. Your journey through skepticism creates wisdom that can guide others facing similar challenges, and passing on that wisdom multiplies the impact of your individual victories across generations of future leaders. As I reflect on a lifetime of facing doubt and transforming it into strength, I have come to understand a profound paradox. Those who are never doubted may never discover their true potential. Doubt, which appears to be an obstacle to greatness, is actually one of greatness's most reliable forges. When I began my career and first encountered skepticism, I saw it as a barrier to overcome, a problem to solve, an enemy to defeat. Now, decades later, I understand that doubt was actually a gifted teacher, offering lessons I could have learned no other way. A trainer building strengths I didn't know I needed, a guide showing me capabilities I might never have discovered. In comfortable circumstances, the leaders I most admire throughout history share this common experience. They were doubted, questioned, underestimated, and dismissed before they were celebrated. This pattern isn't coincidental, it's revealing something fundamental about how true capability develops. Those who face significant skepticism and persist through it develop qualities that simply cannot be built through early acceptance and easy agreement. When everyone believes in your approach from the beginning, you never learn to trust your own judgment above others' opinions. When your methods are immediately embraced, you never develop the internal strength to persist when external support disappears. When your success comes without resistance, you never build the psychological resilience needed for truly difficult challenges. But when you face sustained doubt and prove it wrong through patient competence, you develop unshakable confidence in your own assessment capabilities. When you succeed despite widespread skepticism, you learn to measure your progress by results rather than recognition. When you maintain direction despite criticism, you build the inner fortress that no external pressure can breach. I have watched many promising leaders falter when they encountered their first serious doubt, because they had never learned to distinguish between legitimate concerns and psychological resistance. They had built their confidence on others' approval rather than on demonstrated capability. So when approval was withdrawn, their confidence collapsed. Conversely, I have seen doubt-tested leaders handle enormous challenges with calm competence, because they had already proven to themselves that they could succeed despite opposition. Their early experience with skepticism had become preparation for later tests that destroyed leaders who had never faced serious questioning. This is why I now view every skeptic as a teacher offering you the chance to grow stronger. They're not trying to help you, they may actively want you to fail, but their doubt still serves as training that builds capabilities you cannot develop any other way. Each person who questions your judgment forces you to examine your reasoning more carefully. Each critic who predicts your failure motivates you to prepare more thoroughly for success. The ultimate truth I want to share with you is this: doubt is not evidence of your inadequacy, it's evidence that you're attempting something significant, enough to trigger other people's psychological resistance to change. Comfortable, conventional approaches rarely face sustained skepticism because they don't threaten anyone's worldview or position. When you face persistent doubt, you're in the company of every innovator, every breakthrough thinker, every leader who expanded what people thought was possible. The doubt you're experiencing is the same doubt that faced everyone who ever accomplished something that hadn't been done before. But here's my blessing for those who will continue facing doubt with wisdom and patience. Use every skeptic as a trainer who makes you stronger, every critic as a teacher who shows you how to refine your approach, and every doubter as a reminder that you're pursuing something worth the resistance it creates. Remember that the greatest achievements in history came from people who persisted through sustained skepticism, not from those who only moved forward when everyone agreed with their direction. Your doubt is not a sign that you're on the wrong path. It's often confirmation that you're on a path worth traveling. The final wisdom I leave with you is this eternal truth. Greatness is not forged in the comfort of universal agreement, but in the fire of persistent skepticism overcome through unwavering competence. Every person who doubts your potential is offering you the opportunity to prove that potential not just to them, but to yourself. Take that opportunity. Use their skepticism as fuel for your determination. Transform their doubt into stepping stones toward your success. And when you finally achieve what they insisted was impossible, remember to offer the same gift to the next generation of leaders who will face the same doubt you conquered. The cycle continues, and each person who masters doubt makes it easier for others to follow the same path, from skepticism to strength, from being questioned to being unquestionable, from facing doubt to forging greatness.